Okay, we're back at the Atheist Christian Book Club. We're going to try to go about another 45 minutes or so if the conversation continues. Our book today is Why I Believe, Reflections of a Former Missionary. This is by Ken Daniels. Ken has been nice enough not only to be a member of the club, but to put himself on the hot seat and be able to give his perspectives and answer questions. I do want to take a moment before we get back to Ken's book, though, to talk about our next book. We're going to be next month, October 5th. We're going to share a meal at 6, and the club will begin at 7. And it's Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. And J. Warner Wallace is a homicide detective, active, also a Christian apologist speaker. Brady's interviewed him already. Brady, would you take just a minute to tell us who J. Warner Wallace is?
Yeah, absolutely. J. Warner Wallace is a cold case detective for Los Angeles County. In fact, if you've ever watched this show Dateline, or if you're a faithful watcher to this show Dateline, you've probably seen him. He's been featured 5 times. The most featured cold case detective in Dateline's history. And he was an atheist till about the age of 35. And how he came to Christ was looking at using his skills as a cold case detective and putting the Bible to the test. And so that's how he does it. And in this book, he walks through how he came to that conclusion.
So we're looking forward to that. Brady's interviewed him for another occasion already, so we're fairly confident that he will want to come in.
He's already emailed me back.
Oh, he's already emailed back and said that he will want to address your questions. So I'm thinking of your questions, and we will do a Skype interview with him and bring in those clips on that. One thing you'll like about the book, I think you will, he starts off each chapter by kind of introducing it with a case he worked on. And then he'll draw some parallels on that and some of the principles of uncovering that murder investigation, and he tries to apply that then to Christian apologetics. So I'm looking forward to the book Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. Again, with me this evening is our co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club, Bill Cluck. He's the atheist half of the equation. My name's James Walker. I'm the president of Watchman Fellowship, an evangelical Christian ministry that focuses in the area of interfaith evangelism and defending the Christian faith. Our topic today is Why I Believed. So let's just take a moment, if we can, and talk a little bit more about the book. Do we have any questions, comments?
Yes. There's already one in the live. Can we just go into
it? Yeah, one
now?
from Facebook Live audience.
Sure. I'm going to summarize it real quick. He's basically saying God throughout the Bible is quoted with words of emotion, regret, anger, your frustration with us. So if he knew from the outset that he was going to have these emotions, why? So I'm going to read it now. Here, if God created the world but knew right from the outset everything that would take place in human history, how could he emotionally be affected by any of it? How could he possibly regret anything, either if he foreknew everything that would take place? If I was a creator and had the ability to create the world, I think I'd be wise enough to not create one like this. I guess that's more a comment than anything. If you want
to, address that, Ken?
I think it's maybe more a question for Christians. It's not. I mean, it's something I noticed when I was reading through the Bible, and I raised some questions, but it wasn't one of the things that...
Well, what did you say a minute ago? He needs to go back to the drawing board, right?
Yeah.
What's the best Christian answer you've heard to that particular issue?
Well, I think probably the most common one is that these are metaphorical. God is not a human, but... and I can't really articulate it as well as an apologist can articulate it. Maybe somebody else could speak to it, but I think there's a lot of perhaps metaphorical things going on there. Somebody want to?
Well, in Genesis, you have the priestly writer of the 6th century, and the J writer, the Yahweh writer of 5th century, which is more of a anthropomorphic view of mankind, of God. That is, he wrestles with Jacob. He regrets making mankind. So you have two different.
I repented him in the King James that he had created mankind, before the flood. People rebelled against him. Well, I guess it is a fair question. I mean, it's not one that I've emphasized in my book a whole lot, but yeah, it's a fair question. Why did he go to the process of creating all these people if he knew that they were going to rebel anyway, and then wipe them out in anger?
The God you love, sin.
Bite me. Anyway, my answer to that would be, we are sinners, and we ask forgiveness for those sins, and that's what the whole purpose is. We're not perfect. Nobody in here is perfect, Christian or atheist.
But I think he was saying like God would not be repenting, would he? If he because
No,
God is
no.
perfect. So,
No,
so that's I think
he's perfect. We're not.
right.
I mean, I think the best formulation of that question that I've heard from a non-believing standpoint is the case of Noah's flood. Well, if he knew this was all going to happen, why did he go through the motions?
Good question. I have a question that's really a little bit minor, but on the resurrection chapter there, and former associate pastor of mine's experiences, because you were saying here's that, what's his name? It says here's these 4 points on the resurrection that most biblical scholars agree on, and you say, well, of course, because they're biblical scholars, because they agree on that. He actually said, it should have, actually printed this out, how about that? If the majority of biblical scholars do subscribe to Craig's 4 facts, it should be more surprising or conclusive than that the majority of Quranic scholars believe an angel visited Muhammad in a cave and directed him the teachings of the Quran. Saying nothing more than the majority of those who study religious texts subscribe at least to the basic tenets of those texts. And I think I'd like to challenge that because of experience of my associate pastor one time who was in seminary, and he was talking to his professors, and they says, well, Haferman, it sounds like you actually believe these things. And he says, well, yes, sir, I do. Well, there's people who study biblical stuff who are just as an academic exercise, like history or biochemistry or something like that. So if a majority of biblical scholars believe those, that's not saying that they're Christians or even like that. So
Maybe a parallel argument would be, one of the biggest skeptics of Christianity and critics of the New Testament, Bart Ehrman, is a New Testament scholar. So when Bart Ehrman says he believes there was a historical Jesus, that is significant because not all biblical scholars believe there was a historical Jesus.
Well,
not
again,
coming.
you did concede that the disciples came to believe suddenly and sincerely that Jesus did rise from the dead, correct?
Well, I can't pretend to know exactly what happened, but that's a likely thing.
Well, even John
Yeah.
Shelby Spong, as liberal as he is, says that, and a lot of,
Yeah.
you said
Yeah.
that Barnum changed his mind on the empty tomb, that he used to believe in an empty tomb and now he doesn't. But what I was impressed with is you said that you do believe in biblical scholarship and experts, because what else are you going to believe on it from a historic
Yeah,
approach?
and I know that we had an interview with, what was his name, from Liberty, German
Gary
Senator,
Habermas.
Gary Habermas.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and he's the one that really has promoted the
minimalist.
Yeah, the minimalist.
Minimal facts.
Those four minimal
Uh-huh.
facts that the majority of scholars believe that. I would be interested to know, be able to drill down into some of the responses, what the percentage was.
Yeah.
Was it 100%? Was it 80%? Was it 70%? And what were the faith commitments of those people
Yeah.
that were answered? Some scholars are
Yeah.
firm believers. Some aren't. I'll give you that.
Yeah.
Some are.
I think somebody asked Craig that in a debate, and he said, well, I think about 70% on this, and I think about 65% on this, and he gave something like that.
Well, I think
He's
it's-
more familiar with the literature than I
I
am,
think
obviously.
it's fair to say that
Yeah.
that most people who go into biblical scholarship have some sort of, at least initially, some sort of faith commitment going in. They may be watered down as they go
Maybe,
along,
yeah.
but yeah,
Yeah.
there's a
Can you remind me on this, on the minimal facts, do all the minimal facts, all of them have a natural explanation, that you don't have to believe in the supernatural to agree that the minimal facts could have happened, right?
correct. When
There were people claiming to be eyewitnesses of this resurrection, that suddenly the disciples did believe that Jesus was alive. I mean, whether it happened or not is a whole different issue. But
Right.
did they report it? Did they come to believe that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the best explanation for why Christianity took off like it did, is because there were people who actually believed that Jesus had come back to life and visited them. Paul for one. He was probably the biggest evangelist in early Christianity that caused Christianity to get off the ground.
Yeah.
Would you probably, I guess, you're not omniscient, obviously, but would you guess that maybe Paul had some kind of psychotic break or some type of hallucination, perhaps, or?
See, I should have given a disclaimer at the very beginning that I'm not a biblical scholar or a historian. I'm just somebody who's been through a crisis of faith and giving my own perspectives on these. So I'm not an expert, and I don't want to come across that way. And once you start getting into speculation as to exactly what happened, then you open yourself up to, oh, well, that's unlikely, or then you give another explanation, oh, that's unlikely. Well, yes, any one possibility of what actually happened is probably in itself unlikely, but maybe there's 100 possible different explanations, all of which are unlikely, but maybe one of them actually did happen. Like, it's unlikely that I win the lottery, but it happens.
Somebody does.
So,
Well, let's get to the bottom line here, Ken. 0 to 100%. What's the chance that Christianity is true?
it's very low.
So you're saying it has a chance?
Say less than 1%.
I would
Now,
say,
for the first time, Bill's the ultimate optimist. So there's
Well,
a chance.
Like you being a gentleman.
I did address this, I think maybe a few months ago, somebody asked the same question. And I said on the question of God's existence, I'm probably 80% confident there is no God. But for Christianity, maybe I overstated it, but I said 99% sure that Christianity is not true.
Is that because of Jesus saying, hey, you disciples will not die before you see the Son of
That's
God?
probably the strongest one, is that Jesus predicted his imminent return before his disciples all would pass away. And so he was expected to return in that generation.
And you don't find his transfiguration on the mount with Peter and to be that?
Well, if you read Matthew 16, it's talking about things that don't fit with that particular incident. Admittedly, it did occur chronologically or textually right after that, but there were, the angels didn't come to judge the earth in the transfiguration, and that's what Jesus was talking about. And when he said that some of you who are standing here will not taste death until the Son of Man comes in his glory and the power of the kingdom and judges, I can't quote the exact text, but we can look
No, we
it
got
up.
The gentleman here, is it Mr. Gluck?
Yeah.
Cluck.
Bill.
Did you say that Bart Ehrman in the past said he believed in an empty tomb, but now
He did, and now he does
Now
not.
he
He
doesn't.
believes that he read every early Christian source, and he said the typical thing was just to have them eaten by birds or dogs, wild dogs, to be left as a deterrent on the
Because
cross.
he was there and he saw it, right?
Well, we actually. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, wait a minute. You're saying he does not believe in the empty tomb?
No, absolutely not.
Well, then it would seem pretty easy for someone to say, look, let's roll away the stone, here's the Bible.
Well, that's one of the objections to
Right.
this.
Well,
Well, it
Pentecost-
seems sort of foolish to not believe in the empty
Well, but
tomb.
typical Christian apologetic is the swoon theory. He, doesn't make any sense. He'd be like this guy that's just half dead, coming back and motivating people. The
Well,
wrong
if
tomb.
even if he's all dead, just roll the stone and say, here he is, dead.
Well, I think what he's saying is that Ehrman doesn't think there was a tomb.
Yeah, he thinks it's a later Christian invention
They crucified him and laid
in
him out
Paul's
on the rock.
letters, in 1 Corinthians 15:3 through 15 or whatever, he does not mention the empty tomb. He says he was buried, am I right? But he doesn't mention an empty tomb.
Right.
So
I don't know if we have the video
And
on
that's the
this.
earliest.
I think if you want to go back and search for one of our earlier videos, I think it was when Tim McGrew was here. We had a whole section on were criminals not buried, because and that it was very compelling, the historical evidence that in Jerusalem at that period of time you would not allow a dead body out of the grave over,
That's what
especially
Craig
over
Evans said,
Sabbath.
that
I'm sorry, Craig
they
Evans. It was
wouldn't
Craig Evans.
desecrate
If you look at
the,
the Craig Evans interview that we
what do
did.
you think of that, Ken?
Well, I mean, I think that there's merit to that. The common Roman practice was to allow them to just decay and be torn up by the birds and whatnot, the dogs. But Craig Evans does make a pretty convincing case that in Jerusalem that would not have been the norm. So could it have happened? Could it have been an exception that it happened for Jesus but not for other people that were crucified in Jerusalem? Well, the thing is about all these arguments is they all hang on the, for the resurrection, they all hang on the idea that each of the premises that are put forward have a 100% probability of being true. But historically, we can't look back and say with 100% certainty that this is what happened or that's what happened. We can't say for 100% certain that Jesus was buried. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. Maybe there's a 90% probability that he was, but maybe there's a 10% probability that he wasn't.
The premises are just that the majority of biblical scholars agree on this.
Right.
So that
Right.
it's a probabilities argument.
Yes.
It's not a 100% certainty that the conclusion is true or that each of the premises.
Right.
It's just, it seems compelling that the majority of even atheistic scholars agree on this and this and this. And if these four are true, then, so it's a probability.
Right, then there's a likelihood that such and such happened, right. So, but I'll repeat an argument that I gave in one of my first times that I attended here when this topic came up, that a while back I was going down to visit my son or pick him up from university in Houston, and I misplaced my wallet somehow. I knew I had it. I was getting in the car, and I felt in my back pocket, oh, my wallet's not there. So I get out and I go back in the house. I spend 30 minutes going every place that I had remembered being. I visited this place, that place, everywhere. I looked over and over and over again, couldn't find it. It never dawned on me, or never entered my mind to think that maybe the wallet just vanished, became immaterial and vanished. That would be the last possible thing that my mind would go to. I eventually did find it. It was stuck. It had fallen out of my pocket, apparently in the car and in the crevice behind the seat. Yeah. But I wouldn't have thought of that. It's not a likely thing, but unlikely things happen. But that's an analogy, of course, of, if you're going to make a cumulative case that X happened and Y happened and Z happened, therefore Jesus rose from the dead. Well, I would think, I would expect that you would be pretty near 100% certain that X happened and Y happened and Z happened.
But how much of that are we locked into our presuppositions and our biases? Is it because you're Christian, you're going to think obviously the most likely explanation was he rose from the dead, and if you're atheist or naturalist, you're going to say it obviously couldn't have been resurrection because those things don't happen. I mean, is it just are we forever just locked into our biases?
I think a lot depends on your starting point. Yes, you're exactly right. A lot of it is our what we want to believe in part, what we've been taught to believe plays into it. If you believe that there is a supernatural realm and that God intervenes in our world supernaturally, then yeah, this is a good candidate for something that could happen. But because it looks like when you put all the details together, it looks like, oh, well, yeah, that he probably did rise from the dead. But that's granting a whole lot. It's granting that wallets vanish or people rise from the dead.
Let me
That's the
ask you
point.
this.
That's the point. It's hard to
Possibility.
emphasize.
I just want to bring up a totally different point. I did read the first few chapters of your book recently, and you can really get a sense of the struggle you went through. And one thing I would like everybody to know is a lot of times when people go from belief to unbelief, it's not one day you believe, one day you don't. There's a long process for a lot of us. And I was just wondering, because there is a common misconception that people go convert or deconvert to atheism for either selfish reasons or just flippant, daily decisions. But I don't think that's true in most cases. So I wanted you to maybe address that.
Yes, I mean, I laid it out there in the book.
Right,
You
right.
saw it, just gut wrenching.
Right.
Yeah.
And it feels like something that it was surreal because it felt like it was something that was happening to me. It wasn't like I was seeking to make this happen.
Right,
It's
right.
like it was a dawning on me.
Question from the audience.
That's right. Let 'em finish.
Oh, no,
Go ahead.
Okay. This is a comment, not a question. This guy just dug up a quote from Habermas about that he had compiled 23 arguments for the empty tomb, 23 arguments for the empty tomb, and 14 considerations against it. And then he crunched the numbers and said that's 75% in favor of the empty tomb, according to Habermas.
Okay.
And the question is, I got a question, not from the live chat. Deconverting is one thing. That's a difficult process, just like Cindy was talking about. But it was double hard for you, in my estimation, because your livelihood was tied directly to it.
Right.
The Wycliffe, the missionary. What's your estimation? Because that's how much courage that took. Do you think you're a minority, or the ones that have gone through similar are still living in denial, faking the funk because they don't want to lose their job, they have nothing else to resort to?
I received a number of messages from people who read my book or materials online that I put out. I had a blog, I'm not really maintaining it much anymore. But I've received messages from missionaries saying, yeah, I'm stuck here. I can't, I mean,
What do I do?
What do I do?
Do you
There's
direct
one.
them to the
There's one
clergy
who wrote
project?
me from Guatemala. He's doing. He's providing water, clean water. He's creating, digging wells and making, fresh water available to people. It's a ministry. He's being supported. And he says, "Well, I'm glad I'm not in the evangelistic
right.
ministry. At least I'm doing,
Some
good
practical
works
work,
type
yeah.
thing. But I don't believe.
Do you direct them to the clergy project as a possible way to help?
I
Define that further.
There's a website or a online community called the Clergy Project that is designed to help people that are still in the closet religiously, so to speak. They're not gays and people, but they similar analogy. They haven't come public about their unbelief, and so this is a community, and it's very tightly locked down. I actually joined it early on, but I kind of. I let it fall by the wayside. I didn't really, because I was already through it at the time that it happened. But it's a.
They get support and aid.
Yeah, I mean they called me who was the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Dan Barker.
Dan Barker. He called me and he asked me a lot of questions. Just to make sure that I was a real non-believer,
right.
that I wasn't just seeking to infiltrate
Right.
through.
That would be good, because you're talking about people that are facing a really
Right.
tough.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Dan Everett's story?
I am, yes. Yeah, linguist in Piraha, or how do you
Exactly,
pronounce it?
Piraha, yeah.
In Brazil.
Dan Everett, Wycliffe missionary, says that Piraha in Brazil deconverted him, the local people, because they were so into the immediate. They says, Jesus, have you seen him? Well, no. Have you ever talked to him? Well, not exactly like that. And there was some question about him for a long term spiritual anyway, and he turned out to be a publicity hound in a lot of ways. But he is doing excellently as a linguist in all over the place. He's written some books about his experience like that. So there's a one high profile case from there. Yeah.
Yeah.
But Ken is a lot nicer than this guy.
I'll take your question. I just wanted to follow up with what you asked about livelihood. I give credit to my mother. When I was thinking about what line of education to go into, she knew I wanted to become a missionary, and she said, well, why don't you go to college and get a marketable degree, computer science, and then go into, go to a Christian school, get some Bible while you're there, and then join a mission organization. That way, if something ever happens, and because a lot of missionaries end up going to the field, and health reasons or whatever else happens, they end up leaving the field. And so it's good to have that backup. And so I give her credit. So there's a lot of other people that are in a more difficult situation that all they've ever trained in is religious, that field, and they have no other field to go into. So, Amy.
Okay. And yes, I did not read the book, so I'm sorry about that, but I've known Ken for a long time. So, yeah, my question is that you are living as an atheist, and but as a moral person, but you're not a typical atheist, having grown up in a Christian home. And so, yeah, my question is, do you think that it's possible for somebody that's raised completely as an atheist without any kind of moral grounding to live the kind of life that you live as a moral person today?
Question. Yeah, it's a good question. And I would kind of challenge at least one small part of that atheist who grows up with no moral grounding. I think that every parent, I don't know of a single parent in the world who doesn't try to instill some sort of moral grounding in their children. It may not come from the same source as a Christian morality, but there is. I mean, we all want people to get along with each other. We want people to thrive in society. We're none of us are islands, so none of us can make it on our own in the jungle. We all depend on each other. And if you're gonna benefit from living in society, you've got to learn to play the rules of the game that people expect you to live by. You can't just treat other people like dirt and expect to be supported by them.
At least not openly.
I know people that do.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all relative. I mean, even the most immoral people have some principles. Go ahead.
One more minimal fact that the scholars agree on is that Jesus was buried in a rich man's tomb. Not that he was eaten by dogs, but the scholars agree he was buried in a rich man's tomb. So how you can believe that scholarly view and then not believe in an empty tomb? I mean, if you think he's buried in a rich man's tomb, just go show people the body.
Okay, so I'll take two responses. Again, I'm not a biblical scholar, so I really think
I'm not a biblical
ignorance on that. I'm not going to take a position one way or the other. I know Ehrman does not accept that view that Jesus was buried in a rich man's tomb. What actually happened? Maybe there's a 70% chance he was, and a 30% chance he wasn't. And so we're all talking about probabilities. But to the second point, the public announcement of Jesus' resurrection, according to the text that we have in the New Testament, didn't occur until Pentecost, which was 50 days later. A body would have decomposed and been unrecognizable by that point. So you wouldn't be able to prove that that was Jesus or some other person. They didn't have dental records and things like that.
Well, then they could show him I mean, I don't know how it would be unrecognizable, but show him the blob. Show them the blob. They don't even do that. You know?
This was a new, unused tomb, right?
And he froze in 3 days, so he had all his dental records.
That rich man thing cuts both ways. Like Barton would probably believe, well, a lot of scholars believe it was a late Christian invention, the whole rich man. But there's evidence that, if it was someone from the Sanhedrin, it's a good evidence for Christianity because someone that was against Jesus actually buried him. So it cuts both ways, and there's evidence
but
on
the
both
scholars don't think it was a hoax. That part of
No,
it,
they absolutely do. Some of the liberal scholars believe it was a Christian invention.
Including Jewish. The large majority of scholars believe Jesus was buried in a rich man's tomb.
No, they don't.
Yes,
not
they
at
do.
all.
Yes, they do.
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
But anyway,
I do think that you're right that this idea that Jesus' body was eaten by the dog, I think that's fairly new. I don't remember even studying it when I was in college. And not that nobody believed it, I don't think it was very common. And if you go back and look at that Craig Evans interview that we did with him, I mean, we found the remains of crucified people. So in tombs in Israel, and the famous one with the nail still through the heel. That was in an ossuary, a bone box in a tomb. Some of them were buried, and so this idea, well, we know Jesus, if he was crucified, couldn't have been buried because the Romans never buried their criminals. Apparently, they did in Jerusalem, at least some of them.
Right. At least there's the operative word. At least some of them.
Yes.
We don't know in Jesus' case for sure one way or the other.
Right. So again, but the idea that Jesus was eaten by dogs, it was. I think that the traditional interpretation or understanding was so prevalent that even Bart Ehrman believed it until recently.
and not everybody that was crucified was buried, died. And Josephus, two of his friends were crucified. He goes, "Hey, Emperor, those are my friends there. Do you think?" He goes, "Oh my bad, I get those guys off the cross, please." I mean, true story. They took them off the cross and they lived.
But the ones who are scholars We're not scholars, we admit that. The ones who are scholars believe Jesus was buried in a rich man's tomb.
Yep.
Yes, they do. Look
Well,
it up.
a lot of them
Look
do.
it up.
A lot of them
Look it
do.
up. The majority. The
Well, that's
large majority.
evangelicals. There's
Large
scholars
majority.
that believe he never even existed. So therefore, that wouldn't, they don't even believe in an empty tomb.
Okay, large majority of biblical
Okay, that was
scholars.
it.
I'm not saying 100%. I'm not saying 100%.
That's fine. Let me change course a little bit.
Hang on just a second. We have,
Yeah, we got a question.
let's get Daniel for just a second, if we could.
Hello, Ken.
Okay.
Thank you for, I bought your book, by the way. I spent $10. So I'm
Oh,
you sign it?
I'm making it
Well,
red.
because next year I may expect you to buy mine, right?
There you go.
No, I will say, I'm a believer, but I will say, I mean, you know that, but the part in Corinthians was a very nice chapter. I really appreciated that. The love, 268, 269, for those of you that have copies of the book, it's good. But what intrigued me the most, I mean, I have a lot of questions, but I thought probably maybe the best one to ask you would be to, maybe just for clarification, in chapter 9, which is the meaning chapter, you start off with the basically what is considered to be the Copernican principle, right? That human beings have been sort of dethroned unintentionally by Copernicus. We're not the centerpiece of the universe. And you define anthropocentric, sort of the theistic anthropocentric view, the man-centered view that God is taking care of us. But you take that to a whole new level. I've never seen anybody go down with the worms and the slugs and the cockroaches. You really like brought it down to, and he's like, we have to address this because we're made of the same stuff as slugs. Like, wow, that's the Copernican principle way down to the ground. Anyway, when you get to the end of that chapter, you talk about being a humanist. And I thought if you could explain the difference between how you think that humanism is not also as anthropocentric as the view that you're critiquing in the opening of the chapter.
Okay, so just to back and thank you for those good comments and questions. What I grew up reading things like books like Tim LaHaye and I forget who else it was. It was talking about. I read a book when I was in 9th grade. It was in Africa. Just pleasure reading a book about against humanism, and its main tenet was that humanism is man-focused, and autonomy was the big bad word in humanism for Christians. It's the human autonomy to assert yourself and do what you want. And so that was, in my mind, it was indelibly stamped in my mind that humanism meant shaking your fist at God, being autonomous, being the center of the universe. We are the captains of our own ship. And so that was, for me, it was a very negative thing to think of us in that way as being so egocentric. And so what he was referring to in that chapter, in chapter 9 of my book, was that after I deconverted, I came to realize I was really doing the same thing as a Christian, because here I was bringing the gospel to the people, the non-believers in Africa. I was in the center. I was the apple of God's eye. The Psalms talks about us being the apple of His eye. So we're in this vast, immeasurable universe on this little rock, and we think of ourselves somehow as the center of creation, and that's most Christians wouldn't come right out and say, yeah, we're the center of creation, but it does seem to be a pervasive outlook that we really matter, and so I think maybe you could say we're both equally guilty of. Maybe we'll just call it a draw and say humanists, yes, we're all selfish. We're in it for our own survival. We're in it for our own advancement, but Christians are also ultimately looking forward. Even Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the shame of the cross. There was a reason why. He wasn't just doing it for nothing. He was doing it for the joy set before him. We all act out of our own, whether it's short-term interest or long-term interest. We all do something for a reason, and we all like to think of ourselves as being important. We matter. And is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It can be a bad thing. It can be a good thing.
So just to follow up, you said at the end of the chapter that you see as a humanist, the sort of the telos for humanism is to improve. I thought that was an interesting word versus maybe help, but that you thought that human beings all of mankind needed help improving. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like you still have retained some of that missionary zeal to help people, But it's curious, what would be your humanistic standard of trying to improve people? What would be what is necessary to improve in the human condition?
I think, having just, it's kind of fresh in my mind because I read that book I described, Enlightenment Now by Stephen Pinker. He traces the advancement of human progress over the past number of centuries. And by every measure, and I started off with murder, it's come way down.
Except in Chicago, under Rahm Emanuel.
So we could digress, but overall the trend has been positive. Murder with longevity, with wealth, disease, starvation, everything. Poverty is really on its way out. Extreme poverty in the world is declining precipitously, and there's a goal by 2040. And the goals set in 1990 have already been achieved that they had set for 2020 for the reduction of poverty worldwide. It's on a downward curve.
Another book,
Things are getting better.
the Angels of Our Better Nature, or something like
Yeah,
that.
that was his previous book.
Okay, his previous book. Okay.
But I read a critique on Stephen Pinker's book, and it says it's just a liberal delusion. Have you read the critique?
I've read some.
Okay. Oh, by the way, I wanted to get to your origin of life, fine-tuning, that sort of thing. You believe in evolution, natural selection, but the problem is when you have the origin of life, you have this severe problem. You have the DNA, which is information loaded, but you need proteins to make the DNA, and DNA is a protein. You need a cell body to get all this stuff working. You just to make a protein requires like 300 amino acids. It's just, and they have to be properly folded, and you have to have enzymes to speed up the reactions. It's just improbability after improbability. The Christian apologetic is it's like 1 in a million, whatever, that all this stuff would come together. So if you don't have anything to natural select on, how in the world are you going to get this thing started?
I think I'm going to have to give you the book and sign it.
Oh, thank you.
It's the hardest question yet.
And the most unanswerable.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm going to have to say I'm not a scientist and I'm not a scholar. It does interest me, though, that somebody of the caliber of Francis Collins, who's an evangelical Christian who wrote the book The Language of God that we studied a few months ago, he doesn't use, he says, we really can't use, that's a God of the gaps argument, we can't really use that. He thinks it's plausible that something could happen. But the fact is we don't really know. If it was 4 billion years ago and the world is vast and things were, the sea is deep and the vents, there's all kinds of things that we don't know. We can construct probabilities of this happening 1 times 10 to the negative 500th power or whatever. Those are all just based on speculation. I don't know. It does seem improbable that you would get life from non-life. What I am sure about is that it didn't go straight from non-life to a fully functioning cellular organism with DNA and cytoplasm and all of that.
I think Francis Collins would agree with you.
Yeah, there had to be some intermediate step where you had some sort of maybe a metabolism first mechanism that where was a chemical reproduction before there was true cellular reproduction. So it's hard for us to reconstruct in our own minds what could have happened.
Nobody has even come up with a plausible model of that. I mean, it's not a God of the gaps. It's gaps to the millionth degree there.
Well, and he addresses Michael Bay's irreducible complexity, where you have the bacterial flagellum that has 40 moving parts, and the response is, oh, well, you can have it co-opted. You can have a type 3 secretory system, a part of that, 40-part thing. Yeah. But the problem is, and he addresses this, Wallace addresses this in one of his books, God's crime scene. And he goes over all this stuff like the bacterial flagellum and says that in itself, the type 3, the part that goes in, that's co-opted, that is terribly complex.
We Christians have made the mistake of God of the gaps, and anything we don't understand means God's supernaturally doing it. I think when we close those gaps in, from my perspective, we haven't eliminated God. We just know how God did it, but we have made the God the gaps mistake. But I think atheists can make the same mistake. You can have naturalism of the gaps.
So how do you answer that bacterial flagellum, that terribly complex nanotechnology?
I think by analogy. So I remember when I was in high school thinking how stupid it was that a lizard could develop into a flying bird. What is it? How does that work? Do they, get suddenly a mutation that causes wing buds to kind of stick out, well, that will get in the way when it's trying to crawl through a crack, from escape from a predator. It's in the way, it's not doing anything. So you have the problem of explaining how you get from something that's just there to something that's actually useful. Because when it's just there and not useful, it's harmful. It's in your way, right? So that's a, I always like to cite that example, and I thought, well, I'm pretty smart. I think I thought of that, But then, later on I discovered, well, you have creatures like flying squirrels. Evolution doesn't work usually by generating whole new structures. It takes what's already there and tinkers with it. So for example, you have flying squirrels that, you've already got the arms, let's say, this is just an analogy, but now you got a flap of skin, and if it's trying to escape from a predator, it can glide just far enough to get to the next tree. You know what I mean? It can just, a mutation that introduces some extra flappage of skin is not a complex adaptation or mutation. So just because something looks like there's a big gap doesn't mean that you can't, working it analogically, using an analogy of the one to the other. What we find when we peer into nature, we find lots and lots of these little gaps that we thought were unbridgeable, and by the way, oh yeah, now it works. And I think in the book I described like the mammalian ear is comprised of 3 little bones, right? And they have found that in reptiles, those 3, well, when in the womb, when the mammal is developing, a part of the jaw migrates up into the inner ear and becomes one of those 3 bones. And so there was speculation even back in Darwin's time that, oh yeah, there must have been some movement of evolutionarily of a part of the jaw into the inner ear, but nobody had found evidence that actually occurred. But lo and behold, a few decades ago, they uncovered these intermediate forms that between reptiles and mammals, where 2 of the bones had migrated, but not 3. So, in other words, they found actually not only embryonic evidence that this is what happened. It seems a very unlikely thing. Well, why would you have those bones moving into your ear? It just looks like an invented story. But we've got 2 independent lines of evidence that support that view.
But isn't it compelling, though, that you have abiogenesis and all the human wisdom that we have right now cannot go into a laboratory with all our machines and all of our material and take non-life and create life? And even if we were able to somehow do that, it still says that you have to have intelligence to do it. So this just happened from an explosion, from a singularity, and it just happened to blow up the right way, and we have life.
So the way I look at it is that most scientists, even most apologists like William Lane Craig, the ones that wrote "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist," Frank Turek, they'll subscribe to the Big Bang, for example, 13.7 billion years ago. Any modern apologist worth their salt believes in an old universe. It's hard to find anybody except for a certain kind of closed-off camp of young Earth creationists that believe actually in a young Earth. But I digress. So where I'm going with it is that most Christian apologists don't have a problem with the Big Bang and the development of galaxy clusters, stars and galaxy clusters happening naturalistically. You've got all these dust particles and they start to clump together and they form what looks like a spiral, and things cluster within it. They form planets or stars and planets.
I take objection to the star formation theory, but it's one of the greatest mysteries in astronomy is star formation theory. Astronomers have theories, but they don't really actually have any concise developmental concept of how stars behave. Anyway, sorry.
You have a blog on that?
I'm writing, I have my podcast, and then that's part of the book we're writing as well.
Would you mind, because we're running out of time,
Sure.
could you put
I
a
didn't mean
link
to
on the
interrupt.
Friends of Atheist Christian Book Club on the Friends site? Could you put a link up on that so we could watch that?
Absolutely, it's an audio podcast.
Okay,
yeah, I can
hear it then.
Yeah, it's the star formation is one of the, and it's unfortunate because a lot of astronomers, I'm not saying you did this, but a lot of astronomers will tell the general public that, been there, done that, we solved this problem, here's how stars form, and you go on any website where they're talking about star formation, it looks pretty simple, like we solved the problem, but it is one of the persistently great mysteries of astronomy. Nobody really knows how stars got started.
Do we have one more from the audience?
We have two more, but I'm running out of time. What I'd like you to go ahead and
I was trying to bridge the
finalize.
gap. To say
I'm just gonna read these out.
Yeah, okay.
We're not gonna have time to respond to them, but after this goes pre-recorded on the Atheist Christian Book Club Facebook page. The people that it's addressed to, you can answer it there, so we can do that. All right, this is for the fellow who believes that a majority of scholars believe that Jesus was buried in a rich man's tomb. I'll summarize it. He's basically asking you to cite your source, because even Habermas says that's not the case. So you could, if possible.
First of all,
we can answer it on the Facebook page if that's possible, and then to all the other Christians, in the room, if they have a response to. If there's any credible explanation they can give why Jesus did not return in his disciples' generation as the authors of the New Testament predicted.
Okay.
So that might be a conversation starter.
Looks like, Jim, that you've just given us some homework. So I'm going to say the club is over, but seriously, we have the Friends of the Atheist Christian Book Club on Facebook, and I would like to promote some more dialogue going on there. We raise all these questions. Another thing that we have here in Arlington is every other Thursday there's a gathering over at Hooligans, the bar over there, that's open for atheists and Christians. Sometimes we continue these discussions there. Sometimes we talk about politics or other less controversial topics. Anyway, you're all welcome to that. We can get you on the invite list for that if you'd like to. I just want to say thank you to Ken for putting his to really being an open book for us, literally this evening, and being willing to take questions. That has to be a lot of.
And I want to thank James and Bill for putting this together. It was like a breath of fresh air when I found this group. It was like I had kind of let my thoughts kind of fall by the wayside. I wasn't doing anything in this realm. I wasn't trying to promote anything, but I found a bunch of people that I could relate to. I had visited some atheist groups, and I just felt like I didn't fit in. I was a fish out of water because I was sort of a evangelical in a atheist skin, or vice versa. I don't know what I was a hybrid, type of thing. I didn't fit in there, and I don't really fit in at church that well. Even though people are great, I just don't feel like I can speak up. But here I can come and I can speak up, and other people can speak up, and we can. Iron sharpen iron, it's a great place to be.
Those who are new here, we want to encourage you, even though we don't have a star every time book, we always have an interesting book every month, I think, and I want to encourage you to be back on that. It will get you out of the echo chamber, and I'll talk to atheists and Christians. Sometimes we are the only people who agree with us. That won't happen in this room. The second thing is that even though we're on opposite sides of the issue, something I found strange, we all do agree this is the issue. This is life and death. This is important. And if Christianity is not true, it needs to be clearly articulated as such. And if Christianity is true, obviously, it's a huge issue as well with eternal consequences. So these are important. We all agree on that. And we all... I used to say that our conversations are all friendly, but I think that at least 6 or 8 months ago we went beyond friendly conversation to we are friends at this point. And I trust Jim Hall and Bill and Ken. They're atheists here that I would trust in a problem to pick up the phone. I know they'd be there to help me. When I had my cardiac arrest, the only flowers I got was from Metroplex Atheists.
Sorry about that.
My own staff. But listen, thanks again for being here. Thanks again, Jim, for providing the excellent meal for us. And we will see you next month.
Thank you.
Just get a sock puppet.
Hang on, guys, we have to end.
All right.
Hey,